Thank you very much for being here with us today for FII in City TV.
Thank you so much for having me.
Vijay, tell us about your early years. What has inspired you and shaped you to be who you are today and do what you are doing today?
No, I really appreciate the question. I started my career working in investing in private equity back in the early 1990s, in the early days of private equity. So I've always been an investor, but then I also served in the US government and started to become very involved in understanding what the challenges of climate change mean for investors. And so that's how I've come to the position where, as a founder of Lightsmith, which is a private equity firm focused on the effect of climate change, I've sort of brought that investment perspective and that government and policy perspective to attack one of the most important challenges and opportunities of our time.
To start on a positive note, how can climate change present an opportunity for investment rather than just a problem?
Yeah, so I think it's very important, especially given President Lula's remarks about the Rio Grande do Sul, this tragedy in the south of Brazil, to recognize that climate change is a very challenging and difficult problem and a humanitarian issue. That being said, one of the things that investors always look for is some amount of certainty or the ability to project into the future. And what we see if you look at the scientific evidence around climate change is that the scientists now tell you that some of the changes that will occur because of climate change between now and 2030 and even 2040 are quote unquote unavoidable or even irreversible, but that also creates certainty for investors to begin to think about solutions to that challenge. So what we describe at Lightsmith is something we describe as the unavoidable opportunity. There's an unavoidable set of changes. We will see some amount of climate change, even if we're very successful, if we hold climate change to 1.5 degrees of warming, which I hope that we can. But that creates also opportunity for technology, for investment in solutions and intelligence that can help us understand how climate change will affect water or agriculture, two very important things here in Brazil, or energy or transportation. And that opportunity creates a challenge and an interest for investors, technologists, governments, people to actually see how we can develop a new future that we actually want to live in.
We also heard today at the summit, why are emerging countries more vulnerable than the others in terms of the bad effects of climate change?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the scientific evidence, emerging countries like Brazil, like countries in Southeast Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, all have enormous populations that still remain quite vulnerable to the physical risk and impact of climate change. A lot of them in the global south are more tropical, there's more storms, more floods, more drought that we're seeing happen. We're seeing these events that typically were 1 in 100-year events now becoming much more frequent and severe. The populations themselves have less resources to respond to or become more resilient to the impact of climate change. And so the challenge for the global south, which has contributed the least to this problem, is that it is the most vulnerable to these sets of issues.
Can you tell us about climate resilience?
So climate resilience is the idea that as we see the complexity of the environment increase, we're going to need to actually have new technologies and solutions to help us respond to and even anticipate and get around the impacts of climate change. So we're seeing increased flooding, increased fires, for example, but in response to that, we can also develop technologies like satellite imagery and artificial intelligence that can help us to better predict where that flooding will happen, where those fires will happen. We invested in Lightsmith at a company called Tech, which is a precision agriculture company based here in Brazil that makes farming much more efficient by networking farm equipment together, by deploying weather sensors so that you know how to use water more efficiently, fertilizer more efficiently, pesticides, and this not only reduces cost but increases productivity and helps us manage the production of food in an increasingly complex environment. That is the way that we can actually deal with the challenges of climate change going forward. And it's not just beating back the impact of climate change, but improving our lives, improving agriculture, improving water in spite of climate change.
Globally, which companies recognize all the opportunities you're talking about? Are they more on the finance side, on the tech side, startups?
Well, we see a lot of startups now beginning to focus on what they call climate tech. We actually think that there is almost a hidden opportunity in a lot of different markets for climate resilience technologies and resilience. We did a study recently at the Global Adaptation and Resilience Investment Working Group called the Unavoidable Opportunity that was funded by the Bezos Earth Fund and ClimateWorks Foundation. And MSCI Sustainability Institute and Lightsmith together applied artificial intelligence to the public company market. And we identified out of like 9,000 plus companies that are publicly traded today, over 800 companies that have technologies that can help us understand how climate change will happen and help us manage those risks and impacts. Now, most of those companies don't today call that climate change resilience or climate adaptation, but there are technologies around water, around agriculture, around satellite imagery and technology, around weather forecasting, all of which we think are the beginnings and the starting points for us to begin to manage this challenge going forward.
And which do you find are the liveliest parts of the world offering such solutions?
Well, it's really interesting because it's a global set of challenges and a global set of technologists and entrepreneurs. So Lightsmith invests globally. We invest in developing countries, we invest in the United States. We're here actually this week, not just for the FII Priority Conference, which is a very exciting opportunity to really share global perspectives, particularly in Brazil, as it moves towards the G20, as it moves towards COP30. But we're also looking at opportunities right here in Brazil. For example, even in the healthcare sector. So you may think healthcare and climate change, how do those two things go together? Unfortunately, because of last year's excessive climate-enhanced El Nino, the flooding and other impacts have increased the amount of dengue fever here in Brazil by over 1 million cases this spring. Now that's a huge challenge for people, but it also creates an opportunity for us to develop new ways of reaching those people with vaccination, with treatment, with medical diagnostics. So we're looking at technologies around that can help us really bring better access to healthcare that will help us address what are now going to be more complicated sets of healthcare challenges.
Jay, how difficult is it to integrate ESG criteria into investment strategies?
Well, ESG criteria, if you really think about it, really is about environmental, social, and governance risks. And if you treat it that way, it's critical for any investor to think about what is the impact of my company's investment on the environment, on social situations, on governance, because those are all risks to the performance of your company or your investment. So we think it's a critical way for just normal investors to think about a prudent investing strategy for the future. One of the things I think that's important to recognize now in the climate change environment that we're in is that as Lulo is talking about 2030, if you think about it, if we have this same conference here in Brazil in 5 years from now, in 2030, you will have more certainty about the fact that climate change will unfold between now and 2030 than where inflation will be, where interest rates will be, where artificial intelligence will be, where consumer behavior is going, who Taylor Swift will be dating. And so the reason that we should all think about this as a really important challenge, but also an important opportunity is because we have some of that certainty. So if we deploy capital and technology and entrepreneurship and policy against it, then the world we will know that exists in 2030, aside from all the other sets of uncertainties that we have, will include our ability to manage this problem, this challenge of climate change. That is the unavoidable opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, I really appreciate it.